All right, so we are starting section 3 of chapter 1 of part 3 of On the Mode of Existence of Technical Objects. So we finished section 2 last time. What did we see? The role of technics and religion and the relation between them and how they arise out of magic. So he sort of introduced that schema at the beginning in the introduction of this part, and then now he's gone through in a bit more detail. And so section 3 is titled The Divergence of Technical Thought and of Religious Thought. So this is going to be, again, further details into that process of development of technical and religious thought out of magical thought. Okay, so I'll start reading. Technical thought, resulting from the rupture in the primitive structure of the magical world articulation and retaining the figural elements that can be deposited in objects, tools, or instruments, gains an availability from this detachment that enables it to apply itself to every element of the world. However, this rupture also produces a deficit. The technical tool or instrument has only retained figural characteristics detached from the ground to which they were once directly attached, since they arose out of an initial structuration that provoked the emergence of figure and ground within a reality that had been one and continuous. In the magical universe, the figure was the figure of a ground, and the ground of a figure. The real, the unity of the real, was at once figure and ground. The question of a possible lack of the figure's efficacy on the ground, or of the ground's influence on the figure, could not arise, since ground and figure merely constituted a single unity of being. Conversely, in techniques after the rupture, what the technical object retained and maintained of figural characteristics will henceforth encounter any ground whatsoever, an anonymous foreign ground. The technical object has become a bearer of form, a remnant of figural characteristics, and it seeks to apply this form to a ground that is now detached from the figure, having lost its intimate relation of belonging and capable of being informed by whatever form it encounters, but in a violent, more or less imperfect manner. Figure and ground have become foreign and abstract in relation to each other. So this is picking up where I think where we left off last time about the idea of technical reality as separating from the magical reality. So in magical reality, there's or the magical mode of existence, the world is structured into particular places that have a particular potency. But then in the technical mode of existence, this potency is separated away from those particular places, and so the technical object becomes movable and usable in any location. It's not tied to a particular place. And so in that sense, the figural characteristic is separated from the ground. The ground becomes sort of homogeneous and just a general background that in which any in which a technical object can operate anywhere. There's no structuration of that background anymore. Okay, so this is, like I said, is sort of just picking up on what we saw last time, so there's probably not too much to discuss there. We can go on to the next paragraph if someone else would like to read it.
I can read one.
Sure, go ahead.
The hylomorphic schema doesn't describe only the genesis of living beings. Perhaps it doesn't even essentially describe it. Perhaps it does not even come from the reflected and conceptualized experience of technics. Before the knowledge of the living being and before the reflection on technics, there is this implicit adequation of figure and ground, ruptured by technics. If the hylomorphic schema appears to emerge from technical experience, it is as a norm or as an ideal rather than as an experience of the real. Technical experience, putting into play vestiges of figural elements and vestiges of the ground characteristics, gives new life to the primary intuition of a mutual belonging of matter and form, of a coupling preceding all splitting. In this sense, the hylomorphic schema is true, not because of the logical use that has been made of it in ancient philosophy, but as an intuition of a structure of the universe for man prior to the birth of technics. This relation cannot be hierarchized. There cannot be more and more abstract successive stages of matter and form, since the real model of the relation of matter and form is the first structuration of the universe into ground and figure. Indeed, this structuration can only be true if it is not abstract, if it is on a single level. The ground is really ground and the figure is really figure. It cannot become ground for a higher figure. The manner in which Aristotle describes the relations between form and matter, in particular the supposition that matter aspires to form, matter aspires towards form as the female to the male, is already far from primitive magical thought, for this aspiration can exist only if there is a prior detachment. But here there is just one being, which is both matter and form. Furthermore, perhaps it should not be said that the individual being alone has form and matter, since the appearance of a figure-ground structure is prior to any segregation of units. The mutual relation of correspondence of such a key point and of such a ground neither presupposes this key point to be isolated from the network of other key points, nor this ground to be without continuity with the other grounds. A universe is what is structured in this way, and not a set ensemble of individuals. After the rupture of the primitive reticulation, the first attached beings to appear are technical objects and religious subjects, and they are charged either with figural characteristics or the characteristics of ground, hence they do not fully possess form and matter.
Yeah, so there's a fair bit in this fairly long paragraph, so we can go through it, not quite line by line, but as it develops. So the first the first point to note, I think, is when he mentions the hylomorphic schema. I think, yeah, we've seen this before, but just as a reminder, that means the schema of matter and form, and it generally refers to Aristotle's ontology of matter and form. So the form is inherent in the matter. It's rather than sort of ideal forms in a more Platonic ontology, you have forms that inhere in matter. Yeah, so Simondon, this is one of the key concepts for Simondon is a criticism and sort of reimagining of the hylomorphic schema. So this passage here, I think, is connected also to one of the chapters in the Individuation book, which is precisely about the hylomorphic schema and its development out of a technical image or technical schema. And so the sort of the type of operation that he gives as an example of a hylomorphic schema in operation is the production of a brick. So you have a mold made of wood or whatever it is, and then you fill it with clay, and then you allow it to settle, and then you bake it, and so on. But the general idea is you have this homogeneous matter, and then you have a form in the shape of the mold that imposes the form onto the matter. And his criticism of that schema is that it doesn't account for the interaction, sort of the middle ground between the form and the matter. So it's not just, so the matter is not just sort of bare matter. It's clay that has certain properties. It has to be has to have a certain degree of moisture, and not too much and not too little, and it has to be sort of filtered and processed so that it doesn't have bits of gravel in it, or something like that. So it has to be homogeneous in that sense. And the way that the mold operates is not just sort of a geometrical form that is imposed onto a piece of matter. It's there's an actual operation of forces in that the clay pushes outwards on the mold, and the mold flexes and pushes back inwards on the clay, which causes it to be compressed. So there's an actual interaction of forces between the clay and the mold to make it to produce a brick, and it's not just this abstract shape being imposed on a amorphous bare matter. So that's sort of, I think, in the background in this paragraph is that criticism of the hylomorphic schema. But then he he gives a sort of an alternate genealogy of the hylomorphic schema here, rather than being drawn from techniques, from the idea of molding a brick or something like that. The hylomorphic schema would be drawn from this figure-ground relationship, which underlies all these different modes of existence that we've seen so far. And so this is, as he puts it, it gives new life to the primary intuition of mutual belonging of matter and form. So this is a more dynamic, I guess, conception of the hylomorphic schema. It's not just again, it's not just a geometrical form being imposed on abstract bare matter. It's figure and grounds that have this sort of dynamic, almost living relationship to each other. And because of that dynamism, it makes this hylomorphic schema into something much more dynamic and almost vital itself. Yeah, so maybe I'll stop there for now, and we can look at some other elements as we go along.
It might be perhaps too much of a generalization, but it seems to me like Simondon is, to some extent, presupposing, if I may do this without essentializing, a French tendency of pointing out the externality of philosophical concepts, which implies that philosophical concepts don't have their conditions in themselves. They don't come out of philosophy, but let's say a domain of practice. And so in this case, I'm not sure if it would be correct to call what he's talking about a domain of practice, because it's the magical universe. But still, it is philosophical concepts, matter and form. They derive from something more fundamental than just thought, I'm thinking.
Yeah, that's an interesting suggestion about this being a particularly French sort of mode of thinking. Because it makes me think of, I know that at this time, in the sort of middle of the 20th century, the French philosophical curriculum required students to take some sort of external subject matter, something in the sciences, and so you found a lot of philosophy students ended up taking something in the human sciences, whether it's anthropology or linguistics or something like that. And then you find in the, precisely in the post-World War II era in French philosophy that lots of philosophers are taking concepts and theories and so on from those different human sciences. And, you have the structuralism and post-structuralism and so on. So yeah, I think that sort of externalization of concepts or trying to ground philosophical concepts in something outside of philosophy, I think that may be connected to the French education system and that requirements to take something outside of philosophy.
Oh, thanks. That gives my remark a much better context than I intended.
And so as to your points, I guess, specific to Simondon about the way that he's performing that operation of sort of externalization. So yeah, you mentioned, or you said sort of in passing, the idea that this is a grounding in practice in the magical sphere. And I think that's right. I think, I mean, the magical sphere is, or the magical mode of existence is presented as a sort of unity. It's sort of prior to the split between theory and practice, which develops later on, as we've seen. But at the same time, I think you can call it practical in a broader sense, in a sense that it involves an active relationship of the individual with the world. It's not a contemplative relationship of the individual to the world. So these key points that structure the magical universe are key points for a certain type of action. So like climbing the mountain, for example, like we saw last time. So I think in that broader sense, it would still be a practical sort of sphere in which these concepts of matter and form are grounded.
Yeah, those examples make things more concrete. Now that I remember them, climbing and some other forms of relationship to key points.
And so another point that I think is maybe of interest in this paragraph is the first sort of differentiation that he presents with the more traditional hylomorphism is that dynamical quality of figure and ground, as opposed to a purely logical form and matter distinction. But then the second point is that, so as he puts it, it can't be hierarchized in his model. So that means that unlike in the Aristotelian form and matter model, his conception of figure and ground can't be iterated. So you can't have something that is ground in one, figure. You can't have something that's figure at one level serving as ground for the level above it. It's only you have one figure and one ground, and they play that role essentially. It's not an external property for them to be included as figure or ground for something else.
He seems to be also ruling out a Platonic step-by-step ascent to the realm of ideas.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't think of it that way, but I think that's true. So there's no, like in the Platonic schema, you have the numbers or the ideal numbers that play the sort of intermediary role, and you have the ascent of the soul to the contemplation of the ideas. But in this conception, there doesn't seem to be anything analogous to that in Simondon's conception. So there's nothing like a sort of progressive purification of removing the ground and getting a pure figure that would sort of correspond to Plato's ascent of the soul. And then maybe I think the third, probably the last point on this paragraph is so he just sort of denies or he qualifies the distinction between figure and ground. So he suggests that, or he argues that it doesn't apply to an individual being in the way that the traditional hylomorphic schema does. So he says, furthermore, perhaps it should not be said that the individual being alone has form and matter, since the appearance of a figure ground structure is prior to any segregation of units. So it's not an individual being, whether it's a human or an animal of some kind or whatever it is. It's not that individual being that has form and matter, properly speaking. It's the whole system in which that individual exists. So it's the individual plus the non-individuated surrounding that corresponds to the form and matter distinction. And so again, he's introducing a qualification into the traditional hylomorphic schema here and applying it not to an isolated individual, but to an individual in his environment. Okay, so we can go on to the next paragraph if someone else would like to read.
Sure, I can go. Looks like 61's on the phone. The dissociation of the primitive structuring of the magical universe entails a series of consequences for technics and religion, and through them conditions the subsequent coming into being of science and ethics. Unity belongs to the magical world. The phase shift opposing technics and religion irreducibly leaves the content of technics with a status lower than unity, and that of religion with a status higher than unity. This is where all the other consequences come from. In order to fully understand the status of the technicity of objects, one must grasp this coming into being that puts the primitive unity out of phase. Religion, retaining its ground characteristics, homogeneity, qualitative nature, lack of distinction of elements within a system of mutual influences, long-distance action through space and time, engendering ubiquity and eternity, represents the putting into play of these functions of totality. A particular being, a defined object of attention or effort is always considered in religious thought to be smaller than the real unity, inferior to the totality and included in it, surpassed by the totality of space, and preceded and followed by the immensity of time. The object, the being, the individual, subject or object, are always grasped as less than unity, dominated by a sensed totality that infinitely surpasses them. The source of transcendence lies in the function of totality that dominates the particular being. According to the religious view, this particular being is understood with reference to a totality in which it participates, on which it exists, but which it can never completely express. Religion universalizes the function of a totality, which is dissociated, and consequently freed of all figural attachment limiting it. The grounds related to the world in magical thought, and consequently limited by the very structuration of the magical universe, become in religious thought a limitless spatial as well as temporal background. They retain their positive qualities of ground, the forces, the powers, the influences, the quality, but rid themselves of their limits and of their belonging, which attach them to the hic et nunc. They become absolute ground, a grounding totality, totalité de fond. The universe is promoted on the basis of these freed up and, to a certain extent, abstract magical grounds.
So we saw the one side of the split into of the magical universe. We saw that the technical reality split off from the magical universe as the figural being separated from the ground, and then now this is the other side, the religious mode of existence as the ground side, which is now separate from the figural, and so in that separation, it's no longer tied to a particular key point, like in the magical universe. It becomes sort of all-encompassing and totalizing, and so in that sense, it's greater than unity. It's any given unit that you take, whether it's an individual person or a city or whatever it is always smaller than the total religious unity, or the unity of the divine, I guess you could say. Yeah, so that background becomes, or sorry, the ground becomes a sort of abstract background on which everything else exists, rather than tied to a particular point. Okay, so I think that paragraph was pretty straightforward, so there's not too much to go into in there. So I'll go on to the next paragraph. After the disjunction of ground and figure, religious thought preserves the other part of the magical world, the ground with its qualities, tensions, and forces. But like the figural and technical schemas, this ground itself also becomes something detached from the world, abstracted from the primitive milieu. And in the same way that figural schemas of techniques, once freed from their adherence to the world, fix themselves onto the tool or instrument by objectivizing themselves, so too the ground qualities, made available by the mobilization of figures through technicity, fix themselves onto subjects. The technical objectivation that leads to the emergence of the technical object, mediating between man and the world, has religious subjectivation as its counterpart. In this way, the technical mediation establishes itself by means of a thing that becomes the technical object. In the same way that technical mediation establishes itself by means of a thing that becomes the technical object, religious mediation appears by virtue of the fixing of the characteristics of ground into real or imaginary subjects, divinities or priests. Religious subjectivation normally leads to mediation through the priest, there's a typo there, while technical mediation leads to the mediation through the technical object. Technicity retains the figural characteristic of the primitive complex of man and the world, while religiosity retains the character of ground. So it's interesting here that he characterizes the subjectivation onto this divinity as imaginary. So you have either subjectivation, a fixing of the characteristics of ground onto real or imaginary subjects, divinities or priests. So that it can be either fixed onto a real subject like a priest, or onto an imaginary subject like a divinity.
This is out of joint with where he sort of started historically, but I'm very much realizing that the work of Andrew Feenberg, who who's got this theory called Instrumentalization Theory, which is divided into sort of primary instrumentalization and secondary instrumentalization, where primary is very much about the kind of objective functionality of something, and secondary instrumentalization is kind of how society and social forces and politics kind of penetrate and shape or adapt technology to a milieu. I'm just realizing the extent to which he's kind of using this framework, and I'm sure it will become more evident to me as we go forward, more closer to the present, that this is kind of where this seems like a really important source for him to come up with that theory.
Yeah, I don't know Feenberg well, but I remember that he does cite Simondon somewhere. So definitely a source that he's drawing on. Okay, so we can go on to the next couple paragraphs. They're two short ones, so I think we can read them together.
I could go if, okay.
Sure, sounds good.
Okay. Technicity and religiosity are not degraded forms of magic or relics of magic. They come from the splitting in two of the primitive magical complex, the original reticulation of the human media into figure and ground. It is through their coupling and not in and of themselves that techniques and religion are the heirs of magic. Religion is not more magical than techniques. It is the subjective phase of the result of a split, while techniques is the objective phase of the same split. Techniques and religion are contemporaries of one another, and considered on their own, they are impoverished with respect to the magic from which they come. So I can go on to read the other one. Religion thus has by nature the vocation to represent the demand for totality. When it splits into a theoretical mode and into a practical mode, it becomes by way of theology the demand for a systematic representation of the real, according to an absolute unity. Through morality, it becomes the demand from the ethical point of view for absolute norms of action, justified in the name of totality, superior to any hypothetical, that is, particular imperative. To both science and ethics, it brings the principle of reference to totality, which is the aspiration to the unity of theoretical knowledge and to the absolute character of the moral imperative. The religious inspiration constitutes a permanent reminder of the relativity of a particular being with respect to an unconditional totality, going beyond all objects and subjects of knowledge and of action.
This passage reminds me of a point that Alfred North Whitehead makes, I think, in Adventures of Ideas, if I remember correctly. He argues that the conception of the natural world as a unity, so something that is subject to the same laws everywhere, for example, he argues that that conception derives from monotheism, and as you know, the universe as being the creation of a single divinity that generates it in a certain ordered way and a unified way. So I think Simondon here is making a similar point, that this sort of this conception of a singular order of the world, both in the sphere of knowledge and in the sphere of action. This conception is an essentially religious conception. It comes out of that first split into first split of the magical universe, and then taking that subjective side, it's sort of is a constant reminder of this unconditional totality in opposition to anything that's conditioned and particular.
I am tempted to think that Simondon, at least in these sections, might have another model for a totality that is more open. If this, maybe it only sounds close to me, this one, that is affiliated with religion to some extent. And the open one would be the reticular model, I guess. That word seems to carry some resonance with a more advanced technological society as well.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether that religious totality has a sense of being closed or not. I would think, I'm just trying to remember, because there's a Duff Sun text where he does he criticizes the idea of the universe as being closed in that sense, and precisely because the universe is always subject to transformation and evolution, that is not closed. Yeah, so my inclination is to say that Simondon is probably thinking along those lines here, even when he's talking about the religious universe. So when he talks about totality here, I don't think he would want to give that the sense of a closed totality, but of a universe that is capable of evolution and development. And I think this sort of openness aspect also ties back to what he said a couple paragraphs ago about how how we can't understand the universe as a collection of individual things or a set of individual things. We have to treat this figure ground or form and matter distinction as something that applies to an individual in its environment. So there's a sort of pre-individuated universe, or the pre-individuated structure of the universe that goes beyond the individual, and goes beyond any closed system, I would say. But yeah, I think it's maybe, like, I would say that the text that we've read so far doesn't fully determine that interpretation. That's a little bit of speculation on my part. So I think that's something we can keep in mind as we go along. To what extent is there something like openness of the religious universe or of the religious mode of existence? Okay, so I think we can go on to the next paragraph. So I can read, looks like there's a couple short ones, so I'll do them together. Conversely, technics receives content that is always below the status of unity because the schemas of efficacy and the structures that result from the fragmentation of the primitive network of key points cannot apply to the totality of the world. Technical objects are multiple and fragmentary by nature. Technical thought, enclosed within this plurality, can progress, but only by multiplying technical objects without being able to recapture the primitive unity. Even by infinitely multiplying technical objects, it is impossible to recover an absolute adequation with the world, because each of the objects attacks the world only in a single point and at a single moment. It is localized, particularized. By adding technical objects to one another, one can neither recreate a world nor recover the contact with the world in its unity, which was the goal of magical thought. In its relation to a determined object or to a determined task, technical thought is always at a level inferior to that of unity. It can present several objects, several means, and choose the best, but it cannot always remain inadequate. But it nevertheless always remains inadequate to the whole of the unity of the object or of the task. Each schema, each technical object, each technical operation is dominated and guided by the whole from which it derives its means and its orientation, and which provides it with a never attained principle of unity that it translates by combining and multiplying its schemas. The vocation of technical thought is by nature representing the point of view of the element. It adheres to the elementary function. Technicity, by introducing itself into a domain, fragments it and leads to the appearance of a chain of successive and elementary mediations, governed by the unity of the domain and subordinated to it. Technical thought conceives of an overall functioning, fonctionnement d'ensemble, as a series of elementary processes, acting point by point and step by step. It localizes and multiplies the mediation schemas, always remaining below unity. The element in technical thought is more stable, better known, and in a certain way more perfect than the ensemble. It is really an object, whereas the ensemble always remains to a certain extent inherent in the world. Religious thought finds the opposite balance. For religious thought, totality is that which is more stable, stronger, and more valid than the element. So there's another contrast he's presenting between religious thought and technical thought. So the religious thought is always, or the religious mode of existence is always greater than unity, whereas the technical mode of existence is always inferior to unity. So each technical object is always a partial mediation, but it never recaptures that unity of the magical mode of existence. It's always you can always introduce further technical objects. No matter how many mediations you apply, you never regain that initial unity.
By the way, this will be tangential, maybe. I found in my reading notes something like an allusion to this statement by, what was it? A science fiction writer. I can't exactly remember right now. But he wrote the script of 2001, Space, Kubrick's film.
Arthur C. Clarke.
Yeah. Arthur C. Clarke. Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. I think it's not verbatim, but something along those lines.
Yeah, I wonder how that fits in here, because so in this passage we just read, Simondon is denying that technology can ever recapture that magical unity, but then that Clarke quote seems to suggest that at least from the point of view of someone who doesn't understand that technical object, it would be indistinguishable from magic, so it would seem to regain that magical unity. So I wonder if so the Clarke quote is sort of looking at things subjectively. That is, it's from the point of view of someone who doesn't understand the technology, whereas Simondon is looking at it objectively. That is, when you have an understanding of the way the technical object functions, then it can never reach that primitive unity of the magical universe.
Yeah, it seems like it would be he would contradict that idiom and say that it would be a kind of category error, right?
Yeah, I think it would always, for Simondon, it would always be an illusion. Like the fact that some aliens land on Earth and their technology is so advanced that it looks like magic to us. That's just an illusion because we don't understand it. It's only so if we had a proper grasp of the functioning of that technology, then we would understand that it's not magical, and that there's always that distinction between the magical and the technical.
The other thing that this passage puts in mind for me is the interview in Der Spiegel with Heidegger, where over the course of the interview, he says, the interviewer asks him what comes in the place of the kind of the concealing of, like, what's the sort of ultimate concealing of being, or where do we stand with respect to being now? And Heidegger basically gestures to cybernetics to say that we've sort of reached a pinnacle of the concealing of being. And then later on in the interview, he's asked, well, how do we get out of it? And his answer is, only a God can save us now, right? So this kind of like, I see that sort of here in this sort of last paragraph that we were looking at.
Yeah, I think in the sense that if we sort of map on to like between Simondon and Heidegger, if regaining that primitive unity of being we can sort of map that onto the idea of the unveiling of being in ancient Greece, or whenever Heidegger thinks that sort of presence happened, then that technical reality, in a sense, like the more you try to regain that unity through technical reality, the further away you are from it, because it's something that you can never actually reproduce that magical unity through technical means. So for Heidegger, that there's a sort of I forget the exact wording, but he says like the greatest danger is the greatest promise, or something like that. So his idea, I guess, is that through this confusion of being. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I think it's in the danger lies the saving power, I think is the way he puts it.
Right, that sounds more Heideggerian. Yeah. Yeah, so I think the idea is that as the history of being becomes more and more concealed in the technical reality, then there's a sort of moment of reversal where the presence of being is manifested in that same concealment. So it's a sort of almost a gestalt shift where you sort of see this concealment of being as itself being the presence of being. And Simonto, I think, is denying that something like that can happen. So he doesn't think that there's ever going to be a sort of return to the primitive magical unity. There's only secondary unities that can be developed later on in science and later philosophy, as we'll see. Okay, so we can go on to the next paragraph, I think.
Technics bring, as much in the theoretical domain as in the ethical domain, a concern for the elements. In the sciences, the contribution of techniques has consisted in allowing a representation of phenomena taken one by one according to a decomposition into simple elementary processes comparable to the operations of technical objects. Such is the role of the mechanistic hypothesis that enables Descartes to represent the rainbow as the overall result of the point-by-point trajectory of each luminous corpuscle in each droplet of water in a cloud. It is according to the same method that Descartes explains the functioning of the heart, decomposing a complete cycle into simple successive operations and showing that the functioning of the whole is the result of the play of elements necessitated by their particular disposition. For example, that of each valve. Descartes doesn't ask himself why the heart is made in this way, with valves and cavities, but how it functions given that this is how it is made. The application of schemas drawn from techniques does not account for the existence of the totality, taken in its unity, but only for the point-by-point and instant-by-instant functioning of this totality.
Yeah, so this reference to Descartes here sort of reminds me of what we saw, I think it was in the technical mentality paper, where he referred to Descartes and the idea of the transmission of evidence as corresponding to links in a chain. So in the same way that a rational argument transmits the evidence from the premises to the conclusion, in the same way that a chain transmits force from one link to the next, and the whole chain is only as strong as the weakest link. And so there's the same sense here in this technical reality of a local action. So each element only acts in one particular place in its local environment, and you have to sort of connect them one to another in order to create mediation in a larger scale.
Yeah, the contrast seems to be acting in proximity and acting globally, right?
Yes. So the religious mode of existence has a global action. It's always in connection with this totality, whereas the technical mode of existence always acts in proximity. It's only you can only operate on the object that's near you. And then, so both of those are sort of drawn out of the magical universe, which is not structured either in proximity or globally, but structured by the network of key points. So each of the points is related to its environment, but it's also related to each of the other points in the network. So it's the magical unity has a sort of particular structure that is not either in proximity or global.
to bring Heidegger into this again, but there is a way the meaning of what is near can change. So if you think about wireless communication, there's certainly a certain communication at a distance, influences even, we might say. I don't know, does that resemble religion then?
Yeah, so I think you're referring to some elements from Being in Time, where he talks about distancing and the relation, how space is produced through this relational structure of references. But I think when we talk about wireless communication, for example, like, I mean, basically what we're doing right now, we're all, well, I guess it's not wireless, but we are, communicating from probably thousands of kilometers apart from each other. But in a more, I guess, existential sense, we're near each other because we're in communication. So I think my guess is that would count as a form of proximity. And in particular, when you look at the technical level, there are cables connecting, my building to some trunk line somewhere in the city, which is connected through another cable onto whatever international transatlantic cables and so on. So that each signal is being sent from in proximity in a sort of long chain of technical elements, crossing thousands of kilometers. So it's still acting locally.
Okay, that clarifies. Thanks.
But I think maybe at the same time there is something like the religious aspect as well. Like he always emphasizes that these two modes of existence are complementary. Like each one is sort of the other half of the other. So the religious side, I guess, of what we're doing right now is the fact that we're all sort of subordinated to this this activity that we're doing. Like each of us is less than the unity of this activity of discussing a philosophical text. So we're all subordinated to it, which and that activity is greater than any of us. So I think there's the religious aspect, an aspect of totality to our discussion. At the same time, that there's the technical aspect in the sense that you have the transmission of signals through wires in proximity, one link at a time.
It's a really good book that describes this condition, that basically what you just described. John Durham Peters' book, Speaking into the Air, is quite good for describing a kind of a history of that, of the development of the technical means of communication, and then their sort of religiosity and the ways that they sort of enculture people.
That sounds really interesting. I didn't know that book at all.
I just pasted a link into the chat.
Oh yeah, I see it. Yeah, cool. Yeah, there's all kinds of like I know in the introduction of the telegraph in the 19th century, and then again with the introduction of radio and transatlantic transmission, like the first transatlantic cables and so on. It's people at the time talked about how it created a sense of proximity that hadn't existed before, of being connected to people hundreds or thousands of kilometers away, and so the sort of existential proximity to another person followed these lines of communication. So you might be closer to someone who is hundreds of kilometers away than you are to your next door neighbor, for example, depending on how those lines of communication are structured. Okay, so we can go on to the next paragraph, which I will read. In the ethical domain, technical thought not only introduces means of action, which are fragmentary and tied to the capacities of each object becoming a utensil, but also a certain duplication of the action by technicity. A definite human action considered in its results could have been accomplished by a determinate technical functioning going through different stages. Elements and moments of action have their technical analog. An effort of attention, of memory, could have been replaced by a technical operation. Technicity provides a partial equivalence of the results of an action. It accentuates the awareness of the action by the being which accomplishes it in the form of results. It mediates and objectivizes the results of the action by comparison with those of the technical operation, performing a decomposition of the action into partial results, into elementary accomplishments. In the same way that in the sciences, technicity introduces the search for a how through the decomposition of an overall phenomenon, phénomène d'ensemble, into elementary operations, so too in ethics, technicity introduces the search for a decomposition of a global action into elements of action, the total action being envisaged as that which leads to a result. The decomposition of the action called for by technics considers the elements of an action as movements obtaining partial results. Technicity presupposes that an action is limited to its results. It is not concerned with the subject of the action taken in its real totality, nor even with an action in its totality, insofar as the totality of action is founded on the unity of the subject. The concern with the result in ethics is the analog of the search for a how in the sciences. Result and process remain below the unity of action or of the whole ensemble of the real.
I feel like this should be required reading for students who are beginning to study machine learning and artificial intelligence.
Yeah, it's definitely something that's lacking, I think, in technical education, as far as I am familiar with it, is any sort of reflection on what it is you're doing when you're trying to, produce a machine learning system or artificial intelligence or whatever it is. And precisely one sort of weakness, like you do have, I think most engineering departments or computer science departments or whatever, they do have a course on computer ethics or engineering ethics or something along those lines. But it's precisely tied to some results-oriented thinking in the same way that Simondon points to here. So it's like looking at your AI system and making sure it's not racist in some sort of obvious way. But there's no more total, I guess, understanding of the action. If like facial recognition system being used for police purposes or something like that, rather than the only sort of questions they'll ask about a facial recognition system is, is it reliable in recognizing people, in a non-racist way or something like that. But the ethical questions about the overall use of the facial recognition system are not really introduced.
Yeah, just the idea that you'd actually need to go into the territory that Simondon is describing here in terms of the decomposition of actions, basically, right? Like, so you'd actually, like, it's something that would have to be perhaps emergent from the programming practices, from the software practices that they're engaged in. Like, it would have to be almost a kind of a more metaphysical conversation around what it means to kind of discretize, phenomena or something like that, both social and natural phenomena.
Yeah, because the sort of background assumption that structures a lot of work in artificial intelligence is precisely that you can break up actions into their components and do whatever mathematical operations on them in order to extract data from them. And obviously, that's something that you can do. You can extract data, but the actual meaningfulness of that data is always questionable. If it's not sort of tied to a more total understanding of the action itself.
Yeah, and then just lastly, I wonder, like, I haven't looked into it much, but the way that applied ethics kind of comes in as a kind of rearguard action, like what significance that is, or what dynamic results from the ethical conversation kind of happening last in this kind of retrospective way, where it's like the programming's done, and this is the best we can. This is sort of how we are going to understand how the world is broken up into kind of ethical elements in the same way that the programming has done it with the with datafying stuff in the first place.
Yeah, I think that's precisely what he's pointing to in this paragraph. I think that's a really sort of a prescient understanding of the way that this sort of particularist ethics, so an ethics that is sort of limited to looking at particular actions and saying whether they're good or bad, sort of after the fact. I think that it's so it's something that he was able to point to the way that this sort of accompanies that breaking down of actions into their components. Before that was even something that was really technically possible. Like there were I think like elementary chess playing computers at his time, but they were not anywhere near the sophistication of Deep Blue in the 90s and computers that exist today. So he's pointing to something that didn't even really exist yet, but that has come into existence since then.
In certain moral philosophies that don't necessarily have any reference to machines or computers and their interactions with humans, they even have certain tendencies in this direction of concentrating on the how and the results. I remember some conversations with philosophy students, and in whose departments the central dogma is the consequentialist ethical position. I'm not entirely sure about what it is, but I think it is a similar tendency.
Yeah, moral philosophy is not really my sphere of expertise, but my understanding is that a consequentialist position, or like in general, obviously there's going to be particular sort of sub differentiations within that, but in general, consequentialism means that, yeah, precisely that you the ethical value or moral value of an action has to do with the results that it brings about. Like, the sort of classic exercise of this is the trolley problem, where if you pull the lever, you save someone's life, or you kill one person instead of killing 5 people, or whatever. And so the consequentialist will argue that yes, you should do that because the result is better. You're maximizing the overall good by killing one person instead of letting 5 people die. Whereas the more sort of Kantian approach has to do with the intentions of the action. So if you pull the lever to kill the one person, then you're responsible for killing that person, and so that's an immoral action. That's sort of like my very hazy big picture understanding of the sort of delimitation within the sphere of moral philosophy. But yeah, so the consequentialist position is precisely based on looking at the consequences of an action as being what is morally relevant about that action. And tying this back into the AI discussion, this is something that I know has been discussed with self-driving cars, which this was a big thing like 5 years ago. I remember where people were trying to understand how what sort of ethical programming you would have to build into a car, where a self-driving car might have to decide whether to drive through a crowd of pedestrians or crash into a wall and kill the driver or the passenger of the car. And what sort of calculations should the car make in deciding when is it how to weigh the different lives against each other and so on. That discussion seems to have kind of faded away a little bit because of self-driving cars not working out quite as quickly as the industry expected. But yeah, there's the same type of discussion of like sort of weighing the effects as being what moral reasoning is all about. Okay, so we can go on to the next couple paragraphs if someone else would like to read.
Sure, I can go again. The postulation of an absolute and unconditional justification that religion directs at ethics translates into the search for intention, as opposed to the search for the result that is inspired by techniques. In the sciences, religious thought introduces a quest for absolute theoretical unity, rendering necessary a search for the sense of the coming into being and of the existence of given phenomena, hence answering a why, while technical thought brings with it an examination of the how of each of the phenomena. In possessing a content that is at a lower level than unity, technical thought is the paradigm of all inductive thinking, whether in the theoretical order or in the practical order. It contains this inductive process within itself, prior to any separation into a theoretical mode and a practical mode. Induction, in fact, is not only a logical process in the strict sense of the term. One can consider as inductive any approach whose content has a lower status than that of unity and which strives to attain unity, or at least tends toward unity on the basis of a plurality of elements where each is lower than unity. What induction grasps, what it starts from, is an element that is not in itself sufficient and complete, that does not constitute a unity. It thus goes beyond each particular element, combining it with other elements that are themselves particular, in order to attempt to find an analog of unity. Within induction, there is a search for the ground of reality on the basis of figural elements that are fragments, to want to find the law beneath phenomena, as with the induction of Bacon or J.S. Mill, or to seek only to find what is common to all individuals of a same kind, as with Aristotle's induction, is to postulate that beyond the plurality of phenomena and individuals, a stable and common ground of reality exists, which is the unity of the real.
So yeah, he points to that contrast that I was sort of fumbling towards about the ethics that corresponds to technical reality is has to do with the consequences of an action, whereas the ethics that corresponds to religious thinking has to do with intentions. So it's the why of something rather than the how.
It's an expansive sense of induction that he's talking about, right? It goes beyond theoretical and practical. It is even beyond logical. It reminds me of an earlier section where we discussed the logic and metaphysics relation. Also, late Mason, you referred to Alice in Wonderland and the Deleuze passage.
Right. Yeah. That it's more. Yeah. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know what to make of it. I don't know enough about kind of the subtler distinctions of induction to be able to say much here.
Yeah, so induction is generally just contrasted with deduction, right? So inductive, so in the sphere of logic or epistemology, so inductive reasoning is when you proceed from particulars to the general. You say Socrates is a man and Socrates is mortal. You know, Plato is a man, Plato is mortal, etc. And then you conclude with probability and not certainty. You conclude that all men are mortal. And yeah, so the general, inductive reasoning never reaches absolute certainty in the way that deductive reasoning does. You're always left with a probability which you increase, asymptotically towards unity, but it never actually reaches unity. So I think that's the model that he's drawing on, and he's using the term induction in a broader sense to include any type of action that has that same structure, where it's always less than unity, but you can approach closer and closer to unity, but never actually reach it.
So is the idea that he's including other more sort of embodied ways of kind of groping towards unity that just don't fit that more formal definition?
Yeah, I think what we're going to see in the next paragraph is that he wants to include a utilitarian ethics as being a kind of inductive operation as well. So in the same way that in the realm of thinking, you never approach unity in the same way a utilitarian ethics never reaches unity. It can always just approach it closer and closer, but never actually reach it. So maybe we should just go on to the next paragraph, and that might be a little bit clearer. Okay, so I'll read the next one. It is no different for any ethics that would come directly from technics, to want to compose the whole of the duration of life from a series of instants, extracting from each situation what is pleasant in it, and to want to construct the happiness of life from the accumulation of these pleasant elements, as is done in ancient eudaemonism or in utilitarianism, is to proceed in an inductive manner, by trying to replace the unity of life's duration and the unity of human aspiration with a plurality of instants and with the homogeneity of all successive desires. The elaboration to which Epicureanism submits desires has as its sole aim to achieve the incorporation into the continuity of existence by proceeding in a cumulative manner. For this purpose, each of the desires must be dominated by the subject, enveloped in it, smaller than unity, so as to be able to be treated and manipulated as a true element. This is why the passions are eliminated, since they cannot be treated as elements. They are larger than the unity of the subject. They dominate it, come from further afield than it does, and tend to advance further than it does, obliging it to go beyond its limits. Lucretius tries to destroy the passions from within by showing that they are based on errors. He does not, in fact, take into account the element of tendency in passion. In other words, this force that inserts itself into the subject, but that is vaster than it, and in relation to which it appears as a very, very limited being. Tendency cannot be considered as being contained in the subject understood as unity. Wisdom, having reduced the forces at the origin of action to a lower status than that of the unity of the moral subject, can organize them as elements and reconstruct a moral subject within the natural subject. This moral subject, however, never completely reaches the level of unity. Between the reconstructed moral subject and the natural subject, there remains a void that is impossible to fill. The inductive approach remains within plurality. It constructs a bundle of elements, but this bundle cannot be equivalent to a real unity. Every ethical technique leaves the moral subject dissatisfied because they do not grasp its unity. The subject cannot content itself with a life that would be a sequence of happy instances, even an interrupted one. A life that is perfectly successful, element by element, is not yet a moral life. It lacks unity, which is what makes it the life of a subject. So here's that analogy. So here he's going to use the term induction to describe Epicurean or utilitarian ethics, where the sort of mode of reasoning of ethical reasoning or moral reasoning has to do with the happiness felt at a given instance, and then it's just sort of stringing together a set of instances, and you want to maximize the happiness over that whole set of instances. In the same way that inductive thinking starts out with particular instances of knowledge and sort of strings them together to produce an approximation to general knowledge, but never actually reaches that general. So yeah, it's induction in this broader sense.
I find this passage really fascinating, especially the way this most dispassionate writer talks about happiness, especially the last part, of course. Strangely, it made me think of certain modes of therapy, psychology, how they are implicitly or secretly moral, like cognitive behaviorism. It also tries to make the individual functional, and in that sense, perhaps make them string their life story along in this kind of quasi-technical fashion. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting because I think there's a sort of there's been a sort of revival of ancient ethics in like a sort of a self-help sphere, like especially Stoicism seems to be popular for whatever reason. Yeah, I think in a lot of ways the self-help and psychology sort of play the same role in our society as these ethical systems of ancient Greece played in those societies, where, like in those societies, the religious sphere was sort of breaking down to some extent as a universal frame of reference. And these ethical systems sort of stepped into the place of the religious sphere and provided these frames of reference for structuring someone's life. And I think the same holds for our society, you know, in a broad sense, that religion, it doesn't have that same universal value as it might have had in previous centuries. And the, you know, psychology and self-help sort of play the role of, you know, structuring your life, producing a life story for yourself in that same way. And I think you're right that CBT, in a lot of ways, does lend itself to that that sort of inductive way of structuring your life as just sort of maximizing the happiness across as many moments as possible, rather than something more a more global understanding of what it is to be a subject.
This is ringing a little bit dissonant to me, only insofar as having read like the way that Simondon and other places says that we need to sort of heal a kind of schism between the technical and the cultural or something like that. I'm wondering if you can, Non, if you can say something about how this, like, if this is a sort of account of the subject in relation to the technical, and how does it, like, where does he go next in terms of differing between this and some of the sort of bigger questions that he's posing at the end of the book? Or table it for another time. It's not, I don't know, maybe it's not appropriate to talk about it now.
Yeah, I'm just trying to remember what comes next. I think, yeah, I'm not sure. It might be something we have to just sort of put on our list of questions to keep in mind, because I can't remember in detail what comes next. But the next chapter is about, let me bring it up. Yeah, the relations between technical thought and other species of thought. So he's going to go into the aesthetic thought and philosophical thought and so on, how they are, and scientific thought as well. But I think, now I can't remember for sure, but given that he's characterizing technical thinking as inductive, I think he would want to characterize religious thinking as deductive in a corresponding way. And so that's something we'll have to look out for and see if he does make that analogy, but I can't remember for sure if he does or not.
Okay, fair enough, yeah.
But I think, I mean, it would make sense, you know, if he doesn't actually explicitly say this, I think it would be something sort of a conservative extension of what he says here. It would make sense that the deductive mode of thinking would correspond to religion, in the sense that you're always starting from the general, the totality. So in deductive thinking, you know, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. You start from the all men are mortal, the sort of universal statements, and then you proceed from there to produce instances of deductive knowledge. So I think it would make sense to consider the religious mode of thinking to be deductive in that sense.
Got it. Okay.
I have two thoughts vying with each other inside my head in response to this last exchange you had. There's another thing that captures my attention. First, in this passage, he talks about, in talking about these ethical techniques, how they are trying to reconstruct a moral subject within the natural subject. So this makes me think whether we can extrapolate on his part a search for a subject of morality that would not be distinct from a natural subject. And the second thing that I have been thinking could be related to this, but I'm not sure. Induction and deduction. In the other book, individuation book, he discusses them again, but in another context, he offers an alternative for these two established modes of logical proceeding, and that's transduction. Again, it is supposed to be on these twin tracks of logic and metaphysics. It is both a way of thinking and the way matter or the individual comes into being. Maybe a transductive moral subject is there virtually behind this passage. I don't know.
That's great. That to me, that's reminding me of that is very helpful to sort of hold out where I just couldn't reconcile the way that I'd been thinking about how he's thinking about techniques with this very much. So it seemed somewhat flattered to me in terms of like that we can still come up with a kind of stable moral subject. When you bring in transduction, it kind of throws everything back up in the air again. And for me, that it makes more sense.
Yeah, I think so. The opposition between the inductive and deductive, and then the third stage is the transductive. So I